Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So during last week's lecture video, we wrapped up talking about infancy and a little bit about earlier childhood. So this week and next week, we're going to be talking more about older children, so middle childhood, talking firstly about physical and cognitive development, and then during the next video, we'll talk about social development in middle childhood as well. So a couple of announcements. One, you do have an activity that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. We'll talk about the topic for the activity in the video as we always do. Also, remember that this section is the shortest section of the class, so exam 2 is actually going to open next week. So watch this lecture video and then watch the lecture video I'm going to post at the beginning of next week, and then you'll have everything that you need for exam 2. I will be posting a review video and a practice exam for that as well, but if you have questions as you're studying, please let me know. Okay? So do let me know if you need anything, otherwise we're going to go ahead and get started. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be talking about cognitive and physical development in middle childhood, and then during our next video we're going to talk about social development in middle childhood. So the majority of today's lecture is going to focus on cognitive development, although we will talk a little bit about physical development towards the end. One thing to think about before we dive in here, when we're talking about middle childhood, what ages are we referring to? So we don't necessarily have a hard and fast rule here. Usually we think of middle childhood as starting around the time that a child goes to school, so maybe this is first grade, maybe through elementary years. Basically, middle childhood is the period before adolescence, which then makes it complicated because we don't know exactly when adolescence starts. More on that in our next lecture. So we're talking about somewhere from 6 or 7 until adolescence. Now, when we're talking about cognitive development, we've been discussing Piaget as we go through the different stages. So Piaget had this discontinuous theory of development that we go through these different stages, and that in each stage you have certain cognitive skills that have developed, and then you have some skills that you have not yet reached. So we talked about the sensory motor stage in infants, and then we moved on to that pre-operational stage. So now we're talking 7 to 11. This is the concrete operational stage according to Piaget. Now remember that Piaget had very specific rigid age periods that were associated with his stages, which is one criticism of Piaget. Perhaps some people might enter this stage a little bit earlier or later than others. But according to Piaget, during this concrete operational period, children gain the ability to perform mental operations. So basically kids are able to think about something as long as it's right in front of them. And so then they can solve problems and they can work with things as long as they're tangible, as long as they can see them. So we're talking about concrete examples in the present, not past, not in the future, but right in front of us right now. However, during this stage, this concrete operational stage, kids are not prepared to deal with future issues, hypothetical issues, abstract issues. This is one reason why, for example, if you're teaching math, it's a great idea to use manipulatives to make it hands-on. Kids might be able to memorize the steps, the procedures involved in a math problem, but without those manipulatives, something tangible for them to see and to touch, then it's really just not meaning anything to them. They don't actually understand what they're doing. So the idea during the concrete operational stage is that you need something tangible in front of you to work with. However, we know that we don't stay here. We mature out of this stage. And so then the last stage in Piaget's theory would be the formal operational period, from age 11 to adulthood. Now, if we went into more detail in Piaget's theory, we might discuss different sub-stages. So this is not necessarily saying that an 11-year-old and a 40-year-old have the exact same cognitive process, but basically, once you hit this stage, which would be towards the end of middle childhood, maybe even arguably at the beginning of adolescence, depending on when you think adolescence starts, we have this formal operational period where the child, who is now growing into an adolescent, is learning how to think abstractly, hypothetically, so may not necessarily need something tangible put in front of them. I would argue that it will be easier for them to think logically if they've had some experience earlier with tangible, concrete things. I think that it's very difficult to just jump straight into a hypothetical, abstract kind of reasoning. Better to start when they're younger with hands-on things, and then they'll be prepared for this stage. So it's not necessarily just based on age, but also based on education and the practice that you've received. But the idea is that during this stage, you can think about hypothetical problems, you can follow logical steps to their conclusion. So it talks about deductive reasoning. And whenever I think about deductive reasoning, I think Sherlock Holmes. I don't know if you read the stories or if you watched the BBC show or any of the shows they've had about Sherlock, but the idea of deducing something. When we're talking about deductive reasoning, basically we're going from the general statement that is true to a specific logical conclusion. So one basic example of this, if you say all mammals have hair or fur, and my dog is a mammal, therefore my dog must have hair or fur. So we have a specific situation that is explained because we started with a general truth. As long as you start off with that truth, and as long as your specific situation falls under that heading, then you can make a conclusion about it, a logical, factual conclusion, and be right pretty much all the time. So kids are going to learn how to do that. But there are other things that are going on during this time period as far as their cognitive development is concerned. One thing to talk about here would be memory. So as you get older, your memory is going to change. As kids move into middle childhood, then they will probably have advances in memory as their nervous system continues to develop. So the slides here talk about working memory and long-term memory. You have probably heard short-term memory versus long-term memory. Working memory is very similar to short-term memory. When you think about short-term memory, you think about the information that you're processing right now, and it has a limited capacity and a limited duration. You can only hold a few things in your short-term memory at one point in time. Working memory is very similar. The only difference here is that you're actually doing something with this information. You're actually using it. So, for example, when we do intelligence testing, which is going to come back up later, if we have a portion of our intelligence test that covers working memory, then we might call out a string of numbers and then have you say them back to me in numerical order. So it's not just remembering the numbers, but it's putting them in order. It's doing something with that information, using that information to perform a task. So as I said, it is limited in capacity and duration, but you can improve the capacity of your working memory. There are certain things that we recommend, games that you can play, strategies you can use to help build up your working memory. But then also you have long-term memory, and this is your storehouse that is essentially permanent, unlimited. Maybe to you it feels like it gets full sometimes. Maybe if you've been studying for a test, you think, I have put an entire semester's worth of information in my brain, and my brain is so full that if I learn one more thing, it's going to burst. I mean, maybe that's what it feels like. But that's not really the way that it is. Your brain has a very large, basically unlimited capacity and a very long duration for long-term memory. You can be remembering things from years and years before. So you store information in your long-term memory, and then you're able to retrieve it and do something with it and kind of move it from long-term memory into short-term memory or working memory. So we do make errors in memory, though, right? We know that. We know that sometimes we save information in the wrong way, so we misunderstand something, we misremember something. We store it the wrong way, or we have difficulty retrieving it. Sometimes you feel like if you're trying to remember the name of a person, for example, it's on the tip of my tongue, I can almost remember it. And so you start trying to find bits of information that will lead you to the right place. You can remember that person's name. Certainly we can make mistakes in all the different processes of memory. Now, when we're talking about very young children, it uses 7 and 8-year-olds here. They haven't yet learned the most effective memory strategies, and this is probably because they haven't had as much experience with it. However, as they get older, they'll have more experience, and they'll learn more advanced ways to store information and to retrieve information. So it says that young children might use strategies such as rehearsal. Now, rehearsal is good for certain things. Rehearsal is great at keeping information in your short-term or working memory. So, for example, if you had looked up a phone number and you were trying to find a pencil to write down this phone number, then you might repeat that number over and over out loud to help you keep that number in your short-term memory until you found a pencil. That's great for keeping information in your short-term memory, but it's not the most effective strategy for learning things long-term because you can only hold a few things in your short-term memory. And so rehearsal only works to help you really gain a few things. It's not the most effective way. So as kids get older and have more experience, they learn how to use their learning strategies, memory strategies. It has a few examples here, but you learn what works for you. So things like taking notes, how to take notes. I think that this is something that kids might need to be taught specifically. This may not come naturally. Kids might need to learn how to summarize, how to find the most important points, how to make an outline, for example. They'll learn organization, how to chunk related bits of information together, and that can be helpful for memory. And it talks about elaboration. So when you learn a new concept, one of the best ways to remember it is to take that information and then add your own personal examples to it, because that will help you remember it. So if you're talking about a concept in class, the teacher may give you an example, and you may or may not remember the teacher's example. But if you can apply your own example to that situation, you'll remember that example much better than you will the teacher's example. So as you get older, you learn these strategies, mostly from experience. Now, one thing that we know about our memory is that it is not perfect, and so MetaMemory is a very important skill. MetaMemory is basically your understanding of the accuracy of your own memory. So you are great at MetaMemory if you know when your memory is accurate and you know when your memory is not accurate. For example, if you're taking a test and you're like, okay, I know I remember this information, and you make a good grade on that test, I remember that information, great. Then your MetaMemory was great. Or if you're taking a test and you're like, I don't remember this information at all, and your grade came out very poorly, once again, your MetaMemory was great because you accurately were able to judge whether or not you remembered this information. Think about eyewitness testimony. So someone might say, okay, this person did it, and I'm sure that they did it, and it turns out that they're wrong. What that means is that person's metamemory is not very good. They were confident in their memory. They thought they understood their memory, but actually they didn't. They really were not right in this situation. So sometimes we realize there's a problem with the way we're memorizing information, learning information. This strategy is not working for us. And then if you have good metamemory skills, you'll recognize that it's not working for you. Try something different. But unfortunately, some kids will keep trying the same strategy even though it's not working for them. But as kids get older, they recognize that memory is fallible, that we make mistakes. We're not like a computer. We're not like a video camera. We do make mistakes. And we also learn that it's easier to retrieve information in some situations than it is in others. For example, kids might start to learn that it's easier to take a multiple choice test than it is a fill-in-the-blank test or an essay test. I don't know if you're giving essay tests to 8-year-olds, but the point is, they learn that if they have a clue or cue there, something that will help them retrieve that information, it makes it easier, right? So multiple choice is a little bit easier because it helps you get back to that information versus something like fill in the blank where you don't have that clue to help you find that bit of information. So when we're talking about developing tests, that's a really great segue into our next concept here. So we need to talk about intelligence. And to talk about intelligence, we're going to talk about intelligence testing. And you might wonder why we have these two concepts together. Why do we start our discussion of intelligence with intelligence testing? Shouldn't we define intelligence first and then talk about intelligence testing? Well, the thing about testing is in order to develop a good test, you need to understand all the aspects of what it is that you're testing for. So if we're coming up with a test to measure intelligence, we need to understand all the aspects of intelligence. So the most logical thing here is for us to understand all the different aspects of intelligence, and then, once we have that information, then we can come up with a test that will get at all those different aspects. Unfortunately, what I think sometimes happens is we have an intelligence test, and therefore the topics that are on the intelligence test, that's what we end up defining as intelligence. You see what we did there? It was backwards. We said, okay, well, these are the topics on the intelligence test, so therefore this is what intelligence is, which means that if you have a low score on an intelligence test, then you are definitely an unintelligent person. That's not necessarily the case because our tests are not perfect. So when we're talking about testing here, it talks about psychometricians are specialists who are trained in assessment. So assessment basically means gathering information, and with a psychometrician you're going to primarily be doing that through testing. This was one of my favorite parts of grad school, were my testing classes. So intelligence testing, personality testing, that kind of thing. The idea here, when you want to develop a new test, is that you have the questions that you formulated. You work hard on your questions, but you want to make sure that your test that you just invented has high quality. So what you're going to do is you're going to give your test to a group of people, and you're going to give that same group of people another test that's designed to measure the same thing. For example, if I was coming up with a brand new intelligence test, I would give my test to a group of people. I would also give an established test to those people, like the Wechsler Test we're going to talk about in a second. Now, if the Wechsler Test has shown to be a great test, valid, reliable, then I would expect that their score on my test would be similar to, correlated with, their score on this other established intelligence test. If their score is very different, if they do great on the Wechsler and they do terrible on my test, then there's a problem. There's either a problem with my test or there's a problem with the Wechsler test. So, when you're administering a new test and creating this new test, you want to give it to a large sample of people, and you want to give it to all the different people that might eventually take the test. You want to have a good representative norm group, which just means that if I'm going to give this test to a bunch of people, they're going to be a normative group. I'm going to compare everyone else with these people. I'm going to say, well, I gave this test to 1,000 people, and the average score was 100 with those 1,000 people. So then when I now give my test to someone else, I'm going to say, well, your score should be about 100 because that's what the score was for other people. Now, in order for that to work, I need to make sure that my initial group of people is as large a sample as possible. And I also want to make sure that all the people who might eventually be taking my test are represented. So if I am developing my test and I only give it to women, or I only give it to one socioeconomic status, or one region of the country, or one ethnicity, then I am not accurately reflecting all the people who might end up taking this test. So I want to give this test to a wide variety of people, so then my normative group, the people who are going to be comparing when other people take the test, it should be as diverse as possible and should represent the population of all the people who will eventually take this test. So we're about to talk about several different theories of intelligence and more on intelligence testing, but I do want to discuss your activity. So activity 5 asks you to think about where intelligence comes from. So it asks you the question here, do you think intelligence is based primarily on nature or nurture? So kind of going back to our earlier discussion of this, nature refers to biology. So if you say that intelligence is based on nature, then you would say the level of intelligence that I have is genetic. I received it from my parents biologically. Now, we're going to have some evidence to suggest that this could be the case. But then we're also going to have some evidence for nurture. If you say nurture here, then we're going to say that our level of intelligence is caused by our environment. So the schools that we went to, the parenting that we received, etc. Now, what I would like for you to do is to talk about your own opinion in this, but I would also like you to incorporate some of this information coming up too. So if you think that it's based on nature, tell me your thoughts on why it's based on nature, but also include some information from lecture. If you think it's based on nurture, give me your thoughts on why you think it's based on nurture, but include some of this information from lecture as well. So different theories of intelligence, and this is crucial because your understanding of intelligence will then impact several different things. It will impact the types of intelligence tests that you give. It will impact whether or not you give intelligence tests, whether you think they are accurate at all. And it will impact the way that you view people who have an intellectual disability or a learning disability, as we're going to talk about coming up. So we need to have an appropriate view of intelligence. So we're going to talk about some theories here. Gardner is one of the more famous theories of intelligence, and they call his theory multiple intelligences. So initially we talked about 8 types. Gardner's 8 types of intelligence, but you'll see 9 listed here. So I want to go ahead and address that briefly. Existential intelligence was not included in Gardner's original theory, not directly anyway, but he did discuss it, and he seemed to believe that there was an existential intelligence, but it was not originally included, which means that some textbooks might talk about 8 types and might leave out existential, some might talk about 9 and include existential. But When you go through and talk about this, basically what we're saying is that there are types of intelligence that are not necessarily being reflected on our intelligence tests. And therefore, our intelligence test might give us an inaccurate picture of someone's intellectual abilities. So if there are 8 or 9 types of intelligence, depending on whether or not you accept existential, 8 or 9 intelligence types according to Gardner, you will be high on a few of these and you'll be low on some of these as well. You're not going to find many people who are high on all of them or low on all of them. There'll be some areas that are better for you. So when you talk about linguistic, we're basically saying verbal skills, logical, mathematical, spatial. With spatial, that's nonverbal things like puzzles, reasoning, that kind of thing, nonverbal reasoning. And then also musical skills. You're not going to get a lot of musical questions on most intelligence tests, but you can be musically intelligent. Bodily kinesthetic, so I think here about athletes. I think about a gymnast or a ballerina or Megatron catching a touchdown. You think about an athlete who is able to do things with their body that a typical person's not able to do. And then intrapersonal versus interpersonal. Intrapersonal refers to understanding yourself and your own emotions. Interpersonal has to do with understanding other people and their emotions. And then naturalistic, kind of thinking about understanding the environment, being able to survive. If you were stranded in the wilderness, how long would you last, right? This is definitely not me here. And then whether or not you agree with an existential intelligence, this is the idea of being able to see the big picture, to ask and answer those complex questions about life. So he might say like a theologian or a philosopher might be high on existential intelligence. So basically what we're saying is that these different types of intelligence have different developmental trajectories, so they develop in different ways in different time periods. Some of them might come naturally, some of them might require a lot of practice, and there are certainly brain regions that are different, that have different abilities or controlled by different brain regions. And therefore, if this theory is accurate, then certainly there are aspects of intelligence that are not included on our intelligence test. We'll talk more about what is on intelligence tests in a second, but only maybe, I would say these first 3 are probably pretty well represented on an intelligence test, but the others really are not. Alright, so then what about Sternberg? He had a theory of what it means to be intelligent. So Sternberg would say that someone is intelligent if they can use their abilities to achieve goals, and that there are 3 main intellectual abilities. So you can have an analytic ability, creative ability, or a practical ability. And so kind of similar to Gardner, he would say that you're going to be high or low on each of these 3. That people are not usually going to be high on all of them or low on all of them. So an analytic individual is one who would probably do really well in a college class. This is a person who does well in a classroom. So it talks about generating different solutions, but basically someone who's able to analyze information, memorize that information, answer questions. You think about someone who is successful in a classroom because they're able to test well. They're able to analyze, answer questions, a good test taker perhaps. But there are other types of intelligence. And so it is possible that we might be biased towards an analytical intelligence because this is the thing that's easiest to test for. But Sternberg would also say that we can have creative intelligence, new situations, new problems, being able to deal with those. So this is hard. You'll see that creativity is not on our intelligence test because it's hard to measure if one person's creativity is better or worse than another. We don't have a key that we can grade your intelligence if it's creative. If it's analytic, I can come up with a key. This is the right answer, this is the wrong answer, but we don't have that for creative. Practical is something that is included a little on some intelligence tests, but not emphasized as much as an analytic intelligence. But practical intelligence, being able to actually put something in and make it work. So on the one hand, you might know a lot about a subject, but that's not exactly the same thing as being able to do it. For example, I can read a lot of cookbooks. I can watch a lot of Food Network. I can memorize the ingredients and this goes with this, but that does not mean that I can cook. I cannot cook, by the way. I think about an episode of The Big Bang Theory with these intelligent, engineers, and I think it was Leonard, but one of them was saying, okay, now how many of you understand about an internal combustion engine? And everybody's hand went up. We can all explain how the engine in your car works. And he said, no, how many of you can fix an engine? And all their hands went down. So they understood how it worked, but that didn't mean they were able to actually fix the problem with the car. So Sternberg would say some people are more practical, hands-on, they're able to solve problems. All right. Now, if we're thinking about intelligence and intelligence testing, then let's kind of go back to a very early conceptualization or the concept of intelligence testing. So it talks about Binet and Simon developing what was essentially the first IQ test. Now, what I do want to say here is that the terms that they use are not terms that we're going to use today. Terms like bright versus dull sound offensive, perhaps. Certainly, we wouldn't want to classify a child and say, hey, you're a dull child. Lots of reasons why we wouldn't want to do that. But the general idea here is they were looking at a comparison between mental age and chronological age. For example, if you were an average child, then your mental age would be the same as your chronological age. So we'd be saying developmentally, you're 8. And chronologically, you're 8. You know, chronologically based on time, based on your birth date. So then, according to the terms they used, a bright child would be one whose mental age is ahead of their chronological age. So if you're actually 8 years old, but you're at a developmental level of a 10-year-old. So chronologically, based on your birthday, you're 8, but you're able to do tasks that we would expect of a 10-year-old, then we would say you're ahead, you're advanced, you're precocious, you're a bright child. On the other hand, a dull child, using their terms here, one who's a little bit behind, would be one who is chronologically older than their mental age. So based on your birthday, you're 6. That gives the example here, you're 6, but you're only performing tasks that we would expect from a 3-year-old. Or if you're chronologically 8 and you're performing tasks of a 6-year-old, then we would say that you're a little bit behind here. Not necessarily using the bright and dull terms. Now, what happened was we took that general idea and then developed that into the Stanford-Binet intelligence test, which is still one of the more popular intelligence tests that's out there. And the basic idea behind the score, and so we have a score, an intelligence quotient, that's what IQ stands for. The score compares your mental age to your chronological age. So there's a formula here. Your IQ is equal to your mental age divided by your chronological age times 100. And the average score is 100. So, for example, if you're 7 years old, chronologically, and 7 years old as far as your mental ability, then 7 divided by 7 is 1. And so 1 times 100 is 100. So if your chronological age and your mental age are the same, then your IQ score is 100. And that's average. We're saying you are exactly where you should be based on your age. But if you have a mental age of 7 and a chronological age of 10, then you're going to end up with a score of 70 here. What we're saying is that you're less than average, you're lower than 100 because your mental age is less than your chronological age. But then, if you're advanced, if you're bright, to use Binet's terms here, then you'd have a mental age that was ahead of your chronological age. So their concept of intelligence is basically being able to measure your mental age and compare that to your chronological age. Now, in order to do that, we have to understand what it means to measure a person's mental age or to measure a person's intelligence. And so we have to ask the question, well, what topics should be included on an intelligence test? So, for the purposes of this class, I'm talking primarily about the Wechsler intelligence test, and you'll see that there are 4 categories that are included on the Wechsler test. So, Stanford-Binet is one option for intelligence testing, but one of the most popular ones, and one that I was trained on in grad school, would be the Wechsler test. Now, you have Wechsler tests for very young children, like preschool children, and then you also have the Wechsler scale for children. This is the WISC. Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, and then the WAIS is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So there's a version for very young kids, then the WISC is for kids. So the very young kids is probably 3 to 6, and then the WISC here is for kids 6 to 16, and then 16 and up you do the WAIS, or the adult version. So if you have a 16-year-old, you can be kind of on the fence about whether you should give them the whisk or the waist, because you could technically give them either one if they're 16. But the point is that the Wechsler tests give you an overall IQ score, and your overall IQ score is made up of your performance on these 4 areas. So verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, which would be things like patterns, solving problems, nonverbal information, working memory, as we discussed earlier, being able to remember something and manipulate it, and then processing speed, being able to do tasks quickly. So your overall IQ score is impacted by your ability in each of these 4 areas. Now, you will notice that there are certain arguments to be made, that there are aspects of intelligence that are not included here. So you won't see creativity here, for example. And there's not that much of a practical component here. It's mostly analytical if we're thinking in Sternbergs terms. Now, the way this works is that you take this test and you get an overall score. And your performance on the test is going to be compared with the performance of other children their same age. And you can see why we need to compare with other kids the same age. If you're comparing a 6-year-old with a bunch of 10-year-olds, that's not fair. We need to compare the 6-year-old with other 6-year-olds, the 10-year-olds with other 10-year-olds. And so we would expect that up to a certain point, your ability levels will increase. And then up until you reach a point where then it will start to decrease. So when you become an adult, older adults are going to have a drop off in their memory and their processing speed at a certain age, right? So we're going to compare 70-year-olds with other 70-year-olds. So we're going to compare you with your same age peers to see if you're performing at the same level as your peers or maybe above or below that level based on these 4 areas. So, an intelligence test score is intended to give us information that we can then use to make decisions. Make decisions about, does this person need extra tutoring, or does this person need a different educational setting, or that kind of thing. So, then we ask the question, are our intelligence tests accurately measuring intelligence? Well, one type of validity, if you're talking about if we're accurately measuring what we're supposed to be measuring, that's validity. One type of validity is predictive validity. So are our IQ tests able to predict an outcome? Well, IQ tests are usually pretty good at predicting things like grades, how well they do on achievement tests. Now, one thing to note here, an intelligence test is measuring your potential to learn. It's not asking you specific questions about things you've specifically been taught. That would be an achievement test. So an IQ test that measures your verbal ability is not measuring the vocabulary words you were quizzed on last week. It's not information you've already been taught. It's basically asking your potential to learn if someone did teach you something. Versus an achievement test that would say, okay, well, let's use this math technique we learned last week. Or if you have exam 2 in human growth and development, that's an achievement test measuring your knowledge of the second section of human growth and development. So that's something specific that you've already learned. IQ test scores also predict years of education, occupational success, performance, and earnings. But this is not a perfect prediction. This is because there will always be some people who do really well on intelligence tests but don't have great outcomes. There will be people who do very poorly on intelligence tests and do end up having better outcomes. So it says that the correlations range from 0.5 to 0.7. So this is kind of a middle of the road, not super strong correlation. Why is this? Well, someone might have test anxiety, or maybe we did our intelligence test on a day that the person was sick, they were tired, they hadn't had a good breakfast. All those things impact your scores. But it could also be that there are types of intelligence that are not measured on our test that can still be helpful. Even if you had a poor score on an IQ test, maybe there was something that was an important component of your intelligence that we didn't measure. And it also mentions here about self-discipline. So self-control and discipline is very important for being able to be successful in life. I have seen time and time again students who had great test scores and all of that, very intelligent people who didn't put in the work, didn't put in the effort, didn't end up with the good outcomes. So it's not just about your ability level necessarily, it's also about your motivation, your ability to keep yourself going, and self-discipline can be as important or more important than intelligence. Let that be an encouragement to you, but also a warning. You have to work hard to be successful, right? Okay, now, where does intelligence come from? Well, this discusses twin research. So if we're talking about the differences between fraternal and identical twins, remember that identical twins come from one sperm, one egg that's split into two. So they are very similar in their genetics, almost exactly the same. Versus fraternal twins that develop from two different eggs, two different sperm, but they're in the womb at the same time, which means that they are no more alike, genetically speaking, than any other sibling pair. So we see that fraternal twin IQ scores are less similar than identical twins. If you take that and flip it, we mean identical twins test scores are more similar. So that seems to point to genetics. The only difference between identical twins and fraternal twins are that identical twins are more alike genetically speaking. So that seems to point to biology, nature, genetics. We see that fraternal twin IQ scores are similar to siblings with the same biological parents. So what we're saying here is that fraternal twins are genetically no more alike than any other sibling pair. And so being born at the same time and being the same age doesn't necessarily make your IQ scores any more similar than people who have the same amount of genetic material in common but have a different age gap. So you can have a fraternal twin, but that fraternal twin is no more genetically alike than your brother or sister who's 5 years older than you, assuming that we're all full biological siblings. And we see that fraternal twins' IQ scores are more similar than those of adopted siblings. Well, that makes sense because with fraternal twins, we have at least some genetics in common. With adopted siblings, we don't. So this leads us to our discussion of adoption. That's a great way to look at nature-nurture. What we see is that on most things, adopted children end up turning out more like their biological parents than they do their adoptive parents. And this is especially true for IQ scores. And this is true even if the child never lived with or even met their biological parents. They still tend to be more like their biological parents than they do their adoptive parents, which obviously says that nurture does not impact their intellectual situation as much as nature does. Now, there are arguments that would say, well, this is a small sample size probably because we don't have large samples that we're able to do this with. Also, the fact that someone is adopting impacts this because maybe all adoptive families have certain things in common. It requires a certain amount of money to be able to adopt, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's some research confounds here. But the general idea is there is some evidence to support a role of nature here. But then what about nurture? The concept that our intelligence can rise and fall to the expectations that other people have of us. So, a couple of things here. First of all, it talks about a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is the idea that you believe something is true, therefore you behave in ways that make it true. For example, if you've been told your whole life that you are an intelligent person, then you will be more likely to enjoy school, to enjoy books, to work hard, because you've been told your whole life you're intelligent, and that therefore you can be successful on intellectual tasks. And therefore you may become intelligent. But if you take a child and tell them that they are not intelligent, and I don't like any of the terms we use for not intelligent, but if you take a child and tell them that they're not intelligent, then that child will probably lose motivation to learn, won't try because they think they're going to fail, and they will become unintelligent because of what someone expected of them. So this is related to the idea of a stereotype threat. A stereotype refers to a generalization that we make about someone based on his or her group membership. And so we might believe something. For example, we might say, well, you're a woman, therefore you can't be good at math. That's a stereotype. And we could talk more about this, but we won't. I'll save that rant for later. But the idea here is, if you're a woman and you've been told your whole life that you're not good at math, then that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, where you then behave in ways that make you not good at math. But then also, the concept of a stereotype threat is that if you know that people expect you to be a certain way, that can create anxiety. So what they've done with the research here is that they bring in women and say, we're going to give you a math test to see if this is true, to see if women really are less intelligent when it comes to math. That creates anxiety for the women taking the test, and they don't do as well. If you give women a test and say, we're comparing you to men to see if you're as intelligent as they are, that decreases a woman's score. Versus in the other condition, when we just said, hey, we're doing an intelligence test, we're doing a math test, and we didn't tell them why we were doing the math test, women did better. So it's the idea that when you know that someone does not expect you to do well, that creates anxiety that can then impact your ability level. And the thing about the stereotypes is we know them, right? We've been told them our whole lives. And so that's a nurture component that can impact our outcomes, right? So then what about giftedness? When we're talking about giftedness, it can be difficult to define. It says it's traditionally defined as an IQ score of 130 or higher. So if you were going to be in a gifted program at school, probably they would give you some type of intelligence test. And the average score on most intelligence tests is 100. So we're saying you're 30 points above average here. That might be what we think of as gifted. But it's also possible that you might be gifted in a particular area, such as art, music, writing, dance. Many other things could be included. And maybe your intelligence test score is not higher because those things are not measured on an intelligence test, but you have this special ability level. So there are different ways to think of giftedness. Now, what we see is that children who are gifted usually have a desire for this particular area. They love it, they enjoy it, they're almost obsessed with it, and so they want to focus on that one particular area as much as possible. And then they have a combination of early instruction and parental support. Now, that instruction could come from a parent, or it could come from teachers, coaches, or other people. But they have early instruction, and then they have family members behind them supporting them. So when we talk about giftedness, it is very likely that there is a genetic nature component, that you inherit a specific predisposition towards being good at a subject or good at a skill. But if you're never given instruction or a chance to practice that skill, then it doesn't matter. Who knows? I might have been an incredibly talented gymnast. I find that unlikely because I'm not very graceful or athletic. But the point is, I never was able to practice gymnastics as a child. So I feel like now I need to lay on a couch and talk about my mother. But the point is that if you're not given an opportunity to practice a skill, if you don't have support, then you're not going to be able to go on to be successful in that area. So it's a combination of nature and nurture. So then what about on the other side of things? What about children who are behind? So we talked about giftedness, children who are ahead. What about children who meet criteria for intellectual disability? Now, one note here, intellectual disability is the correct term now, because the manual that we use to diagnose, the DSM, was updated in 2013. It's now in its 5th edition. And in the 4th edition, they use the term mental retardation to refer to this diagnosis. But I think primarily because of the stigma associated, and I want to encourage you not to use that term, especially not in a derogatory sense. Keep it classy, please. But the correct term now is intellectual disability. So 2 criteria here that both must emerge before 18 years of age. If the person starts to have problems after 18 years of age, when they've already had normal development up until this point, then we're looking at a health condition, substance use, traumatic brain injury, perhaps, something like that. But when we're talking about someone who has had problems earlier in life, we're looking for 2 main things. So limitations in intellectual ability, which typically the way we score this, we test this, we use an intelligence test. So if we said that 100 is average and 130 is gifted, then on the other side of things, 30 points down, 70 and below is usually our cutoff for intellectual disability. But in combination with that, you also need problems adapting to the environment. So people who have intellectual disability usually have some problems with day-to-day functioning. So things like self-care or relationships or being able to be successful in a classroom setting, social setting, a work setting, that kind of thing. If you are having no problems adapting to your environment, then we would not diagnose you with intellectual disability even with a low IQ score. You need both of these things from an early age to be able to receive this diagnosis. So basically what we're saying is your ability level is not fitting well with what you need in your particular situation, which could be school setting, work setting, home setting, etc. So then a child who has an intellectual disability is conceptualized as being one who is a little bit behind in their development. And so then you have to ask the question, how far behind are they and why are they behind to begin with? So typically when we're thinking about how far behind someone is, we're going to look at that intelligence test score. So sometimes someone might be in that 70 range or even 71, 72, and we would say you have intellectual disability, but it's not as severe versus someone who has a score in the 40s or 50s, right? Now, where does an intellectual disability come from? It gives 4 areas here, but be aware that there's going to be substantial amounts of overlap. So someone can have intellectual disability because of a biological reason, which could be related to genetics. We're thinking about maybe Down syndrome here, or it could be malnutrition, traumatic brain injury, which would be something that, an accident that happened that then caused medical damage here. So someone might biologically inherit a lower level of intelligence, but then there's also substantial overlap between other aspects here of your environment. So social, so the environment that you live in, the relationship that you have with your parents, which then will of course be impacted by the parenting that you received. Domestic violence, child neglect, living in a situation where you don't have access to books, you don't have access to good school systems, that kind of thing. So basically what we're saying is that if you have parents that are abusive or neglectful, if you're in a setting where you don't have access to high quality education, if you're living in poverty, you have nutritional issues, especially if you have a nature thing going on here, some kind of diagnosis biologically. We might also think about fetal alcohol syndrome as being one of the most common preventable causes of intellectual disability. Then certainly as these risk factors increase, then you'll be more likely to develop an intellectual disability. But it's probably a combination thereof. So then how does an intellectual disability differ from a learning disability? So with an intellectual disability, your overall IQ score is low. What we see is that with a learning disability, your performance in a particular area is not matching up with your overall IQ. So for example, someone might have an IQ score of 100, but their math performance is very poor. They're not able to do well on a math test. So then you might say they have a math disorder because their ability in math is not lining up with their overall intellectual ability. So it also says they must not struggle with some other condition. So sometimes we think that a child has language issues when really they have hearing issues. It may be hard to diagnose hearing loss in young children. So if it's based on sensory deficits or poor instruction, I mean, if the child's not receiving a good educational environment, that could be a reason why they're struggling in a particular area. So what we're saying is that there's not another reason that accounts for it, that your performance in a particular area is not as good as we would expect based on your intellectual ability. It talks about this being diagnosed in about 5% of school-age kids. Certainly there is the possibility that this is underdiagnosed, that we might not always notice it. Now, the correct terminology here is a specific learning disorder with impairment in, and then you fill in the blank. So it could be in mathematics, it could be in reading, could be in writing, could be in oral expression. Now, you hear terms like, for example, dyslexia. This is a term that people use frequently, but it's not the term that the DSM uses, our manual that we use to diagnose. So we're going to learn the correct terms. I know that specific learning disorder with impairment in reading doesn't roll off the tongue like dyslexia does, but this is the correct term for it based on the manual that we use to diagnose. All right, so that's talking about cognitive development. Let's also briefly discuss physical development during middle childhood. So we're talking about the elementary school years basically, and so this is a time where girls are about the same size or then maybe even taller towards the end of this period. So it talks about 11 to 12 years of age. Girls can end up being a little bit taller than boys. So this might feel like an awkward time for both boys and girls, with girls being a little taller, boys haven't yet got there. So girls may hit their growth spurt a little bit earlier. And it talks about puberty might be different a little bit for boys and girls as well. Growth is based on lots of things. It's based on your genetics, especially your height is very strongly impacted by your genetics. But then it also is impacted by your nutrition as well. So it talks about wanting to make sure that kids receive an adequate number of calories and how important it is to make sure kids are eating breakfast. And kids really do need to graze throughout the day. They really do need snacks to keep them going and to help them focus, in the classroom. Snacks, food's very important. So what about motor skills? When we're talking about motor skills, we're talking about gross motor skills versus fine motor skills. And gross motor skills involve large muscle groups and large movements. So throwing a ball, jumping, those are gross motor skills. So we're definitely going to see an advancement here. If you spend time around a mixed age group of kids where you see some kids are older, some kids are younger, and they're all running around together, you can definitely see that the 3-year-olds running around on their little stubby, cute legs may have a hard time keeping up with the older kids just because those motor skills have not developed yet. But fine motor skills require very precise movements, very small muscle movements here. And it talks about handwriting as being an example of the development of motor skills. And you may see some significant improvement in handwriting, but some people will just naturally have better handwriting than others. We're going to see that girls tend to do better in fine motor skills. Handwriting is not the only example of a fine motor skill. I think about watching my son put together Legos and connects and those kinds of things. There are other fine motor skills as well. So even if your handwriting's not great, don't feel too bad about that. Some gender differences that we see here. Girls are better at fine motor skills. It talks about handwriting. This is a generalization. So we're talking about, as a population, girls versus boys. Yes, there'll be some boys that have great handwriting. Yes, there'll be some girls that have terrible handwriting, but on average, girls tend to have neater handwriting. And there are certain gross motor skills where girls tend to do better, things like flexibility and balance. When we're looking at the differences here, there's a nature component and a nurture component. The nurture component here may be that we put girls into sports and things to help them develop. So we think about ballet, gymnastics, dance, that kind of thing, where girls learn flexibility and balance. On the other hand, boys are more likely to have opportunities to do things to develop their gross motor skills. So thinking about football and soccer and basketball and that kind of thing. But there is also a nature component when you think about body type. So even from a young age, but especially as we hit puberty, you'll see that girls have more body fat and boys have more muscle. A reason being that girls need a higher percentage, they need a certain percentage of body fat to be able to be fertile, which, I mean, we're talking about adolescence and adulthood here. I'm not wanting to discuss fertility in middle childhood, but my point is, girls' bodies are geared more towards carrying a baby, and so therefore need a higher fat content there. To be able to do that, their bodies are prepared to carry a baby and then to breastfeed, so need to have fat stores, that kind of thing. Okay, more on that coming up when we talk about later ages. So it may be a nature thing about their body types, but it may also be a nurture thing because of the activities that they're involved in. Boys may be more likely to be involved in sports activities, both in what am I trying to say? Both in a formal situation and an informal situation. So we might put boys on more team sports, but boys might also just get together and play in an informal way that's more athletic than girls do when they get together. So then this leads us to a brief discussion of physical fitness here. Obviously, it's good for kids to be active, and this does not have to be necessarily a formal setting, a team sport kind of thing, but we want our kids to be active. This is a concern because obesity is an epidemic. Lots of different things contribute to obesity. Part of this is also genetic, but part of this is diet, and then we have to add the discussion about physical education. When it talks about doing too many activities that don't involve moving, let's think about that. It's not that watching TV is bad necessarily. The research says, what are you not doing while you're watching TV? So the question about television making you unintelligent, there's nothing wrong with watching TV as long as you're still doing other things, right? But if you're only watching TV and not reading, then it's not the watching TV that's the problem, it's the not reading that's the problem. The same thing here with exercise. If you're only watching television instead of exercising, then that's going to create a health risk here. So then the question is this a school issue that schools need to resolve? We need to have more recess time, and I'm not opposed to that. I think especially young kids need to move more. We need some
maybe just informal playtime, more recess time, moving around time for sure. But it also says it's poor use. I was talking to someone the other day and was telling me that when she was in school, it had been a little while, but when she was in school on a rainy day, they played Uno. When it was, gym class, they were sitting around playing Uno. So maybe it's not just that we don't have enough time set aside, it's that we're not using the time that we have set aside in a good way. Which then leads us to a conversation about sports. Do you want your kids to be involved in organized sports? There are a lot of things to consider here. You want to consider the health of your child. You want to consider the self-esteem of your child. Sports can be fantastic if they're done in the correct way. So if you have adult-led sports where the adult is focused on teaching the kids new skills and the child is learning social skills and cognitive skills, there's a lot of strategy involved in seeing how the other team is lined up and what skills they're using, and then figuring out how to be successful against that particular defense or whatever the case may be. There's a lot to learn cognitively, socially, from playing sports. But if the adult is only focused on winning and shames the children, or makes the children feel bad about themselves, or creates this unhealthy level of competition, then sports are stressful for kids. Sometimes we wonder why kids don't want to play sports, but if you go to any sporting event, you'll have parents yelling at their kids. And I'm guilty of this as well. My son played soccer one year, and I was not upset with him for not being athletic. I was upset for, not listening to the coach. But the point is that we get sometimes fired up about sports and we forget these are just children. And they're out here to have fun, and that's the main thing, to have fun and to be active. And as long as we keep that goal in mind, that's great. But we need to be aware that there is a very small percentage of children that will go on to play college sports, let alone professional sports. And we should not expect that of our children, right? Let's be kind. Let's extend grace to other people. All right. I'm going to stop there before I get into too much of a rant. All right. So that is today's lecture on middle childhood. During our next lecture, we will talk about social aspects of middle childhood. And then after that, we're going to have exam 2. So let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget about activity 5. And I will talk to you guys next time. Y'all have a great day.